Good evening, everyone, and again, welcome to the Kawakeb webinar series. Today is a special webinar, in all fairness, because we have a guest speaker whom I happen to work with for quite some time on quite a number of things, and I've learned a lot, not only from the information that Dr. Upshur is providing during our meetings, but also from his resilience. And I don't know, maybe where you are, Ross, a day is more than 24 hours because you work on 101 million things. So really, thank you for giving us of your time, and I'll let Diana introduce you. Thank you for being here.
Hello, hi everyone, good evening, and thank you for joining us. So to try to briefly introduce Dr. Upshur. Dr. Ross Upshur is currently the Dalai Lama Chair in Clinical Public Health and the head of the Division of Clinical Public Health at the Dalai Lama School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. He's also the scientific director of the Bridgeport Point Collaboratory for Research and Innovation, and Associate Director of the Lonnenfield Tannenbaum Research Institute. He is a professor and in the Dalai Lama School of Public Health and the Department of Family and Community Medicine, an affiliate member of the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology, and a member of the Center for Environment, as well as an adjunct senior scientist at the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences. He's a staff physician at Hennig Bridgepoint Hospital, and during the COVID-19, he has served as the chair of the WHO Ethics and COVID-19 Working Group, and is a member of the WHO ACTA Ethics and Governance Working Group. Finally, he is an elected fellow of the Hastings Center and the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. So without further ado, welcome, Dr. Upshur. Thank you very much for giving us from your time, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to be here with you today. It's a real honor and privilege to be part of this webinar series, and thank you to Talia. As she mentioned, we've had a lot of work together over the years, and I've been waiting for the opportunity to participate in your thriving and vibrant intellectual community and with bioethics scholars. So let's get started. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about looking to the future and whether we actually ever learn lessons from pandemics. So the outline of my talk is follows. I'm going to go a bit back into the distant past and move to the recent past. Then I'm going to engage with this discussion of learning lessons because it's become a very common trope in policy and news circles that, you know, we've really got to learn lessons from this SARS-CoV-2 COVID-19 pandemic. Then I'm going to switch to sort of the ethics component and argue that there's what I would call a pandemic playbook. In other words, there are certain constitutive issues that have raised their head in virtually every modern epidemic, and I've worked on them since the 90s, and then look to the future about how I think we might want to envision bioethics playing a larger role, because my primary thesis is that our response to a pandemic is constitutively ethical, not epiphenomenal or on the side. In other words, dealing with the ethical challenges posed by pandemics is probably the core business of health systems and healthcare professionals globally. So I want to start with the independent panel for pandemic preparedness and response. At the World Health Assembly in May of 2020, they commissioned this report, and it reported in 2021. And in hindsight, you can see that's probably a bit of wishful thinking on their part, because of course here we are still in the grip of a pandemic here in Ontario and Toronto, where I live. We still have very substantial circulation of Omicron BA.2 variant, and a large number of people becoming ill and sick, though our health system is not overwhelmed. So making it the last pandemic is a nice thought, but it would be nice to have it done with before we started to really engage with this. So from the executive summary said, we can't afford to focus only on COVID-19. It must learn from this crisis, otherwise momentum will be lost. And they claim that COVID-19 has been a terrible wake-up call. And now the world needs to wake up and commit to clear targets, additional results, resources, new measures, and strong leadership to prepare for the future. And as they say, we have been warned. One of the co-chairs of the independent panel, Ellen Sirleaf, the former president of Liberia, was quoted in the Guardian saying, "The situation we find ourselves in today could have been prevented. A new pathogen that became a catastrophic pandemic that now has killed more than 3.25 million. That was at the time of the report, and of course it's twice that now, and continues to threaten lives and livelihoods all over the world. It is due to a myriad of failures, gaps, and delays in preparedness and response, and this was partly due to failure to learn from the past." So the two key issues to remember from this sort of introduction are wake-up calls and learning lessons from the past. So I want to start with a few quotations from Albert Camus' book, The Plague. And early on, I was encouraging people to read this as kind of a nice way of trying to understand the psychology and philosophy of pestilence and plagues. Of course, then it became part of our life world. But he states, "Everybody knows that pestilences have a way of recurring in the world, yet somehow find it hard to believe in ones that crash down on our heads from the blue sky. And there have been as many plagues as wars in history, yet always plagues and wars take people equally by surprise. And unfortunately, the global situation, we are now afflicted with both war and plague. And unfortunately, we were taken by surprise by both." Now, tracking back in history, there are many, many good accounts, and there's lovely books of history that have been written about plagues and peoples and the history of pandemics. But Thucydides, in his History of the Peloponnesian War, talks about the plague of Athens, and he makes this interesting observation that physicians were not of any service because they were ignorant of the way to treat the plague. They dyed themselves the most thickly as they visited the sick most often, nor did any other human art succeed any better. Supplications in temples, divinations were found equally futile till the overwhelming nature of the disaster at last put a stop to them altogether. And back then, some very fundamental epidemiological insights that we've seen once again in the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. People who provide care to those who are afflicted with an infectious disease tend to become ill themselves. And so I'll return to this notion of duty to care and obligations to care a little further on in the talk. As we move through history, we know, for example, this is the picture of someone suffering from leprosy. They have their Lazarus bell to ring to warn people that they're coming so that they can turn their backs. We know that infectious diseases are highly stigmatizing, that people afflicted by infectious diseases are treated typically by some form of separation. And indeed, there was a prayer of separation that was read over people when they were first determined to be leprous. And if you read that, so I use this slide just to, if people are unclear that there may be normative dimensions to our interaction and infectious diseases, that the language here is as normative as you can get. I forbid, I forbid, I forbid, I command, etc. But when you look at what you're actually forbidden from doing and being commanded to do, it's very much resonant with what we've been telling people to do during the pandemic in terms of public health measures. Don't touch anything. Don't go out to any jurisdiction. Only use things for yourself. And don gloves. Don't touch anybody, and only eat and drink from your own vessel. Oops. Similarly, when we get to the Great Plagues in the Middle Ages, Daniel Defoe's Plague Diaries, the same sort of thing happens. Plagues defying medicines, physicians seized, men went prescribing and dropping dead. And so skillfulness in medical care did not protect people from the ability to be infected. And of course, throughout time, we've tried various different treatments. For example, here is a fumigation box for the treatment of syphilis, and just bear that in mind as we go through. So now I want to come to the contemporary landscape. In 2003, there was a SARS outbreak. It wasn't anywhere near the extent of a global outbreak that we've seen, for example, with SARS-CoV-2. But where I live in Toronto was one of the most badly affected cities during that pandemic. SARS was supposed to be the great global wake-up call. And for example, the cover of two major American news magazines had covers, one saying the truth about SARS, why the virus spreads, is China covering up, how scared should we be, and what do we need to know in the new age of epidemics. This is in 2003, and these kind of issues again surfaced in 2020 when SARS-CoV-2 came about. If we compare and contrast, the plague doctor's personal protective equipment consists of glove and masks. The beak is, of course, for poultice, because the houses they would enter with bubonic plague, constellated, densely packed masses of lymph nodes filled with pus are not terribly aromatic, and the pointy stick is to aid in the palpation of those buboes. And the only difference between the then and now is the absence of the stick and the advent of plastics, gloves, gown, and face protection. So in Canada, after SARS, we started to, and globally, people were starting to become concerned about the potential advent of an influenza pandemic. In particular, H5N1, highly pathogenic avian influenza, was tracking as something that was of concern. But we never did get the major avian influenza. This right-hand picture here is of a train at the border between, I believe, Hungary and Romania, when they'd found a case of highly pathogenic avian influenza. And I like to point out that the only people at risk are the unfortunate gentlemen with the fumigators that they're spraying at each other with a small paper mask, and I'd actually not seen many birds actually traveling on top of trains. Rather than H5N1, we got H1N1, the so-called swine flu, in 2009. Then after that, in 2014, we came to the Ebola outbreak. And at that time, the head of the World Health Organization claimed that Ebola was the greatest peacetime challenge in UN history. And of course, in retrospect, it looks like a very limited outbreak in comparison to the SARS-CoV-2. But what sort of issues arose? Well, this need for, and I'm paralleling here the claims that were made about Ebola, that urgent resources and assistance were needed to tackle the crisis. It was actually then being managed by the UN, and it was a threat to peace and security. Similarly, COVID has been seen as a threat to global security. There was the use of lockdown. I believe that the lockdown in Sierra Leone during the Ebola crisis was the first major lockdown of an urban environment in modern times. And we see the same sort of lockdowns being applied globally during SARS-CoV-2. The use of quarantine measures, and this picture on the top right is a picture of barbed wire that was put up by Liberian authorities to keep the members of a neighborhood out from inside the neighborhood instead of moving out. This there was pushback to this, and eventually they had to stop using these measures. And of course, we've used the same sort of quarantine measures in SARS-CoV-2. Fears about long-term sequelae and the return was haunting in the Ebola outbreak. And of course, we have concerns about long COVID and the possibility of infection and reinfection. And we'd be remiss not to mention the MERS outbreaks that have happened, one in Seoul and and of course the Zika outbreak that occurred in South America and became a global issue as well. And with SARS-CoV-2. So my one message for the future is when you start to see the media with lots of fumigators, you know something is definitely going awry, even though it's unclear whether this environmental decontamination actually serves any public health good. So what is it about lessons learned? So after Ebola, there was a massive outpouring that we really needed to learn lessons. Down here on the right, Bill Gates published an article in the New England Journal that we need to learn lessons from Ebola. And this is 2015, so really only 5 years before SARS-CoV-2. Major humanitarian organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières also published their lessons learned. But this is nothing new. And here, just speaking on the Canadian experience, we had a major lessons learned activities after SARS in 2003 and after the 2009 H1N1 pandemic. And you'd be hard pressed to find these because, as you can see, if you go to the Public Health Agency of Canada's webpage, they've been archived. They've now been, I think, largely because of my prodding, you can now access these, but it just goes to show how quickly we hermetically seal off the past. So SARS was also supposed to be a wake-up call, as was H1N1, as was Ebola. So once again, hearkening back to that language from the independent panel report, which is telling us that SARS-CoV-2 is the wake-up call. And once again, when COVID-19 came, well, this is a wake-up call and we have to learn lessons. So quoting from the independent panel report, so it claims that a public health emergency of international concern, the so-called FAKE, is the loudest alarm that can be sounded by the WHO Director General. And here I just have a graph that shows since the revision of the international health regulations in 2005, and they were revised after SARS so that the global community could better respond to public health emergencies of international concern, that the alarm has been ringing for pretty much the last 7 years for polio, but there have now been several public health emergencies of international concern, all of which are supposed to be wake-up calls, all of which we're supposed to learn major lessons from. So if this is the loudest alarm that we can possibly raise for these pandemics, I would suggest that we need a new alarm clock. So after Ebola, I started to get a bit grumpy because having worked on SARS in Toronto and worked with the World Health Organizations and others in pandemic preparedness and H1N1 and Ebola, it seemed to me that the most important lesson that we would learn from Ebola is that we don't like to learn lessons. We can, as we say, we hit the snooze button repeatedly and learn the lessons all over again when the next outbreak emerges. So we either have some form of collective amnesia because we can't retain in our memory, or we have collective narcolepsy because we recurrently fall asleep and require a new wake-up call. So how does this translate to, this is a bioethics group. So my argument is that there are structurally similar events in all pandemics and in a set of associated ethical issues, all of which can be anticipated. So as going back to Thucydides, we note that there are high early morbidity and mortality amongst healthcare providers and family members and caregivers. This was the case also with SARS-CoV-2, and we know that the alarm was sounded by a physician in Wuhan, an ophthalmologist who became infected, tried to spread the word, fell afoul of the authorities, and unfortunately succumbed to his illness. And this raises issues around the duty to care and the duty to treat. And one of the roles I played in the pandemic preparedness back in the aughts was heading up the co-chairing the duty to care of healthcare providers in pandemics. We provided a report. But there are a lot of issues still left outstanding. And as much as you can astutely and carefully articulate what the ethical issues are, you need buy-in from institutions to sort of act upon these. So articulating what are the duty to care. And it still stuns me. In SARS in 2003 in Toronto, we did a major study. And healthcare providers said, I didn't sign up for this. When I became a nurse or a physician, I did not expect to become ill in the conduct of my duties. And again, we heard this during SARS-CoV-2. So this is an issue that we need to take seriously. Again, dating back to Thucydides, what was he saying? We don't know how to treat this. It's the same thing with SARS-CoV-2. Early on in the pandemic, we lacked any effective medical countermeasures. There was no vaccines, no effective oral antibiotics or antivirals. And that means there's a lack of evidence. There's also a lot unknown about the virus, which means that you need to invest in research. And Talia has been with me on the working group that I co-chair for the World Health Organization, which is part of the R&D blueprint, which was the WHO's attempt to mobilize the global scientific community across 9 working groups to generate research evidence to better manage the pandemic. So this puts research ethics front and center, and this call for pandemic exceptionalism. This is the argument that given the urgency of the crisis, that standard research ethics processes ought not to be observed. And we push back against that by saying that even if it's a global health emergency, the welfare and well-being of human subjects who are enrolled in research projects still need to be maintained, and there's still an important role for research ethics boards. Now, are there ways in which we can be more nimble, which we can be more responsive and more collaborative? Absolutely, and we might want to talk about that. The third moment is that in the absence of effective medical countermeasures, we're reliant upon public health measures, isolation, quarantine, when vaccines come along, vaccines. And this brings us into the dimensions of public health ethics and how we justify restrictions on liberty in order to achieve public health goals. Finally, scarcity will raise its head, and this has happened, of course, during SARS-CoV-2. When the vaccines came, there weren't enough of them. When the medications came, there's not enough of them. And we've had allocation issues predominate with intensive care beds here in Canada, with personal protective equipment, with vaccines, and with therapeutics. And as we build up, we notice that, of course, there's structural inequity, both local and global. This is not surprising to people who are involved in public health. We've known since the early 19th century that illness and infections are not distributed randomly through populations, but constellate amongst disadvantage. And this brings us to issues in public and global health ethics. What are the roles of solidarity and equity in our understanding and response to the pandemic? Now, interestingly, we entered into this pandemic, I thought, well prepared. In fact, when we went for the first WHO R&D blueprint meeting in Geneva in February of 2020, and myself and my co-chair, Dr. Beatrice Tomei, were to present, I thought, ethics, we've got our house in order. Colleagues of ours from the Nuffield Council on Bioethics on the 28th of January incredible timing, had just published a major report on research ethics in public health and global health emergencies. There was extant documents that had been produced on guidance for managing ethical issues in infectious disease outbreaks, the so-called Green Book, and I was part of the production of that. There was pandemic influenza guidance document, which was easily adaptable to the COVID situation, and also and training manuals available for ethics in epidemics, emergencies, and disaster. However, none of this seems to have translated into policy making and into pandemic response. And the big question for me is why? If we're learning lessons and those lessons seem to be normative every time, what accounts for this disconnect? Well, part of it, I believe, is that in order to understand the ethical dimensions of a pandemic requires integration of ethical reflection at multiple levels. And this has been true in every pandemic or epidemic that I've mentioned, and it's been explicitly true during SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19. There's personal ethics. Am I going to be adherent to public health measures? Clinical ethical issues, have been predominating in the hospital here where I work. Professional ethics, as I mentioned, about obligations to care, organizational ethics, public health ethics, and global health ethics. It also requires that we grapple with the complexity that a pandemic forces upon us, where we need to integrate knowledge from basic sciences such as, genomics, microbiology, immunology, clinical medicine, zoology, as we grapple with the zoonotic origins of this outbreak, epidemiology, law and regulation, psychology, anthropology, and geography. And sadly, we've known about this quite clearly for some time. When I entered my public health residency training in the early 1990s, was around the time that the Institute of Medicine's Emerging and Re-emerging Viruses report came out. And the blueprint and understanding of how these events are shaped and their probability of occurring is well known. This notion of what are the emergence factors, demographics, zoonotic hosts, vectors, susceptible humans, emergence factors, as we've noticed with SARS-CoV-2, a highly adaptable and mutating virus. And we've had no shortage of examples of emerging infectious diseases since the 1980s. And this is an older slide. It says 2012 and beyond, after which we've had Zika and now major Ebola outbreaks, both in West Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and now SARS-CoV-2. So why are infectious diseases important to bioethics? Well, I think until now, every bioethicist is interested in infectious disease ethics, but previously, a colleague of ours, Michael Selgolid at Monash University, published a paper in bioethics noting the almost complete absence of sustained bioethical scholarship on infectious diseases and epidemics. I think I've established that they're of historic significance, and they're certainly of present significance. And if Camus is true, we will have future pandemics come down on our heads out of the blue sky. I think they challenge many of our traditional and familiar concepts, at least in orthodox Western bioethics, about autonomy. It crosses borders, as I've noted, from personal to global bioethics. And of course, really, it reinforces our universal vulnerability. We are both victims and vectors alike. All of us are capable in a pandemic where we have no pre-existing immunity of becoming ill, and by becoming ill, spreading to others. So how can we better serve? How can ethics be better served, or how can ethics better serve pandemic response? So despite numerous complaints, I think that the research ethics guidance are sound and well established, and we need to just stay the course and support REBs locally and globally. I was struck at a recent WHO Collaborating Center meeting by the fact that despite tens of billions of dollars being marshaled to the global scientific R&D efforts. None of the REB chairs that I have spoken to have been given additional resources in order to enhance their capacity to respond ably and agilely to the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, yet they still, REB chairs are still facing the same complaints from investigators that they're not rapid enough in their response. So we need to see research ethics as an integral part of the research ecosystem. But I think we also need to work on better knowledge translation of ethics into pandemic response. The topic is completely absent from that independent panel report, and I had a small grant funded by the WHO to look at the extent to which ethics guidance was integrated into WHO technical guidance, and they live in completely separate worlds. Almost none of the technical guidance documents, all of which had very strong normative components, made any reference to the extant ethics guidance that were actually on point to the epidemic response. So in the bioethics community, we may need to draw from other fields, particularly knowledge translation and implementation science and health communications, in order to better craft our approaches. And I know Talia has been very active in this because she sent me many of her really high quality and excellent infographics, which I think are the kind of translational documents we need to prepare. But I also think we need better preparation and training of both health professionals and policymakers. It's striking to me that very few of my clinical colleagues will look to their codes of ethics to help them figure out what the limits of their responsibility may be in a pandemic. And in fact, in the past, they have spoken to them. With colleagues, we summarized what we thought, and you can see Talia was part of this group, about 5 key ethical lessons that, we can no longer have this need to wake up and learn lessons. We actually need to learn, and we need to learn based on not just SARS-CoV-2, but on all of the previous epidemics that we've learned more or less the same lessons. One of the things is we need to be better at articulating and prioritizing overarching goals. What is the overarching goal of the pandemic response? Is it to reduce morbidity and mortality? Is it to preserve economic well-being of society? What is it? Because without articulating it, you can't tell whether you're making progress to those goals. We need to really break down silos and work collaboratively. And we have to remember that disproportionately, the vast amount of harm done by pandemics and epidemic disease falls upon vulnerable individuals and populations, particularly older adults and populations that suffer from structural disadvantage. And again, speaking to our own community, we need to improve our ability to communicate the importance of ethics to the broader community. So to conclude, ethical issues are constitutive to pandemic response. They arise in every pandemic I've been part of, but they're poorly integrated into response plans. There's abundant research and guidance on all of the elements. I've put 5 elements in the playbook. There's probably more. And for the most part, ethical issues are not recognized as such and therefore not addressed or poorly addressed. And finally, conclude with Camus' observation at the end of the book. Dr. Ryu remembered, he's reflecting, he says, he knew those jubilant crowds, he knew what they didn't know, but could have learned from the books that the plague bacillus, and if you think of the plague bacillus just as a metaphor for any infectious disease or pestilence, it never dies or disappears for good, that it can lie dormant for years and years, that it bides its time, that perhaps the day would come when, for the bane and enlightenment of men, it would rouse up its rats again and send them forth to die in a happy city. So I'm going to conclude there and happy to have a conversation. I hope this was of some use and benefit, but I appreciate the time to be with you here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ross. As usual, I will allow myself to raise 1 or 2 questions and give time for my colleagues to raise theirs. So you began and you ended with a reference to Albert Camus. And those of us who've read Camus know that the plague is not simply a tale about a disease or a pandemic in the city of
Yes.
Oran, rather a reflection on the human condition and
Yeah.
perhaps the obligation of humans to one another. If I recall correctly, Rio at one point says the only way to fight the plague is with common decency, which reminds me of his other book, The Rebel, in which he said, I resist, therefore we are. So do you see this happening with the COVID-19? Have we really learned that lesson when we can say, I resist, therefore we are? Okay, so solidaire et solitaire, as he says. And why not? So that's the first question. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, why don't I respond to that one first? I think that you're absolutely correct that, it wasn't just about an infectious, it wasn't just about the plague. It was truly a reflection on the human condition. I would like to say that we have learned the importance of solidarity, but the evidence, I can speak here from Canada, speaks to the contrary. So Canada is kind of a soft communitarian nation. It's certainly not, doesn't have the values of our neighbors to the south. There's more of a community spirit. Our motto is peace, order, and good government, not, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And early on, I would say for waves 1, 2, and 3, there was a huge amount of public support for healthcare providers. There was a lot of care and concern for neighbors. But things have soured actually in the last few months. It's like there was a limit past which citizens could hold to this notion of solidarity. So you probably saw in the news we had this convoy of truckers that descended upon the nation's capital and essentially paralyzed it for several weeks and required the government to issue an emergency order because they were also protesting at borders. So this notion that we were moving towards solidarity, but then this kind of really selfish libertarianism started to surface, and people were feeling aggrieved that their freedoms were being, curtailed needlessly. So I would hope that we might want to reflect back after this and take this very seriously in whichever community we live in, to sort of, because it's going to happen again. We would be foolish to believe that once we're finished with this wave or that wave, or if COVID finally sort of peters out and becomes quote unquote an endemic seasonal respiratory virus, that we're not going to face another pathogen in the not too distant future. And as that graph I showed illustrates, they've been coming with alarming frequency. So that's my reflection on that. I'm not in a terribly hopeful mood in early 2022, having witnessed what we've seen with my fellow Canadians.
Yeah, I totally understand. And actually, you did, in a way, reply at least partly to my second question when you talked about communitarianism and selfish libertarianism. So again, you concluded with the last chapter in Camus, and I'll go back to the last scene, if I recall it correctly, when Tarot and Rio were swimming in the Bay of Algiers. And at one point, all of a sudden, their strokes begin to synchronize. So the question that I'm asking here is, what does it take for the globe, for human beings, or let me put it differently, why are we not synchronizing? Is it a bourgeoisie versus proletariat? Is it a power issue? Is it biopolitics? Is it necropolitics? Why is it that the world is not synchronizing?
Yeah, that's a big question, and I have some thoughts, though, as pale and weak as they may be, having thought about this considerably, because of course outside of concerns with communicable diseases, we have a very pressing and looming concern with climate change, which is going to truly require global, it's going to require everybody to swim in sync. So, the educator in me holds out that still our best tool, so to speak, in the toolbox, our best asset as a species is our capacity to teach and learn. But we're going to have to spend some time thinking about what makes for effective teaching and learning and where in the life cycle we're going to focus our efforts. And my sense is that if we start to focus and start as early in the life course as possible, on what it means to be a citizen, not only of the country that you live in, but a good global citizen, and what's required, what are our obligations to others. If we can inculcate that earlier rather than later and take it seriously in elementary school training, that we may have a hope. I think our impact as we move later in the life course, it's been interesting teaching graduate courses. And, I've also trained, lots of medical students and residents, as well as graduate students, how fixed people's attitudes and views become. And I find it takes at least a 12-week course before I can persuade well-trained health professionals to think slightly different about these issues. So it's going to require a concerted effort and a concerted educational effort if we want people to do this, from a sense that, from a moral sense, not from some form of regulated or compelled form of behavior, that they're doing this because they see the logic, the rationality, and the importance of it from, so to speak, as an unreconstituted Kantian, from some sort of moral sense within, that it's not just a matter of our inclination and self-interest, but there's something broadly generalizable that we need to draw from. I'm not sure if that's a very useful answer.
It does, it does. Thank you. And if it doesn't work, they at least will believe that their goodwill will continue to shine as a jewel, I guess.
That's exactly.
So thank you, Ross. I'm going to give floor to my colleagues. Dr. Ismail Lahir from British Columbia, and then Diana and Tala will moderate the rest.
Another Canadian on the...
Yeah.
Well, it's 8 o'clock here anyway. So anyway.
Yes, you're up early. Thank you.
So as you know, in Canada, there was some effort amongst the population in trying to lay blame on the origin of which people or which country or which place started the COVID-19 pandemic. How much do you think that focus has hindered our efforts at public education? Is it's an easy way, an easy task to just go out and find somebody to blame, but how does that help, or does it help?
Yeah, my general sense, and again, if you look back through history, they called the 1918-19 influenza pandemic the Spanish flu, even though it had no origin in Spain whatsoever. So we're very quick to look for somebody to blame for being the origin, and it was somebody else's behavior. But if you look back at that framework for emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases, and also that global map of where diseases have emerged from, it becomes abundantly clear that they can come from anywhere on the globe at any time. And therefore, there's very little benefit in trying to find somebody to blame. Now, part of that blame game was this narrative that developed about it being a lab event. In other words, that there was research going on at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, some sort of gain of function type research that was being done on coronaviruses, and a virus leaked out of there. And I think that became an unfortunate distraction because it focused people on somebody being culpable rather than it being a species issue. So if we step back and we ask ourselves, why is it that we're seeing more Ebola virus outbreaks, more influenza outbreaks? And they just happen to be in avian populations and haven't spread into humans. If you follow ProMed, which is the Program for Emerging Diseases listserv, you get a daily update on outbreaks of infectious disease, not just in humans, but in animals and plants. So it's part of the landscape of being that infectious diseases will emerge, and they'll emerge into human populations from pretty well anywhere. And the interesting thing about SARS-CoV-2 is we've seen it's been adapted to. We had an issue here in Canada where it moved into the deer population. We've seen it move into the mink population. So they can reservoir in animal species and they can reemerge into humans. And it's that interaction between humans and the broader natural environment, which is where we ought to be focusing our attention. And that means that we're collectively responsible for every emergence of a new virus, because you will look at and find the drivers that led to its emergence. So blaming and shaming serves no purpose whatsoever, in my view. But it's sure something that humans like to do. I hope that addresses your question. I see the hand by Gladys.
Hi, Russ. Yes, my name is Gladys. I'm currently in Lebanon, but I used to be at U of T, so glad connected. Yeah. I have a question for you, because this is becoming like a norm nowadays. I was just talking to somebody from Ukraine, and she was telling us how egocentric some people can be when it comes to life-saving situations. For example, and we had the same issue in Lebanon during the pandemic and also during the economic crisis. So there are some really necessities such as medication, supplies, protective equipment, and people were hoarding on them, and they were keeping them for another purpose other than protection. And this is exactly what's happening now in Ukraine. So instead of having those medications and sending them for the collective good of everybody, they're keeping them so that they can make benefit out of it. I really can't explain how people can think that way. I mean, what triggers those kind of extreme behaviors, which are really destructive, while everybody is thinking for, to help each other. Some people are thinking of just making profit out of it. So what drives people to do this, honestly?
Well, I think so long as a fairly substantial number of us see that as being wrong and are able to articulate from multiple lines of argumentation, either through normative theory, and this is really where normative theory plays a great role, because as most people who, my background before I went into medicine was in philosophy, and philosophers have spent, thousands of years arguing with each other. But oftentimes you find convergence of different rivalrous theoretical perspectives on certain cases. And in cases of, exploiting misfortune and disaster for personal profit, I'm not sure even the most diehard libertarian could defend such a practice. So the greater fear for me is the eclipse of that and the normalization of that behavior as not only acceptable, but appropriate. If we get to that stage, then we're truly in a post-normative phase, and we have descended into what people have feared for, decades in the 20th century. The absolute rise of nihilism. There is no value other than that which is satisfying some individual's desire to maximize their own power and ability. So as long as we can find language, concepts, and ways of pointing out that this is not acceptable, we have a chance. But as soon as that type of behavior becomes normalized, acceptable, and even held up as being exemplary, then we're in deep trouble.
Thank you so much.
And nothing I'm going to say is going to change people from, being black market profiteers. It also occurs, and I think it was the same in the plague. There were the people who were seeking to exploit, but none of them are seen in particularly flattering light.
Yeah, thankfully.
For the time being, who knows about the future? Ismail, I see your hand again, please.
So I'll put on my medical education hat. The easy solution would be to say, yes, there should be more awareness in the health sciences and education across the board. But do you think this education should span beyond the health sciences into all other domains at universities and schools? So is it restricted to the health sciences, or should we educate people in other disciplines as well?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, as I mentioned in my answer to one of Talia's questions, I think we should be including this in primary school education, right? Speaking of, medical schools, we knew after SARS that there was a problem because we had during SARS here physicians refusing to show up for work. And I said, we really need to make this part of the interviewing and the orientation of students to their medical career, that they're going to face these situations and they need to be prepared to face these situations. But I agree. I think one of the things about the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic is that it's been an all of society impact, which means, just as you're pointing out, that the educational efforts have to span far beyond simply the health sciences. And actually, I would argue that the type of advice, we're doing some work now looking at the practices of science advisory tables. Like whose voice needs to be at those tables? I think it's far beyond simply biomedical science, medicine, and public health. We need to actually draw from all of our traditions of learning and thinking so that we can actually think about not just a scientific response, but a wise response as well. So yes, I completely concur with your thoughts there.
So I guess we don't have more questions. Ross, thanks a lot. Appreciate
Well,
it.
thank you.
I hope we continue to have you in our Kawakeb.
Yeah. Well, you know me, Talia, once you've got me, I'm hard to get rid of.
Yes, and I'm happy for that.
Okay.
So thank you very much and have a good day.
My pleasure.
Thank
Take
you,
care,
everyone.
everybody. Be well. All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.